I gave him 7 years of my life, my talent, and a heart I never offered anyone else. In university, he was the boy who shared his last ramen with me. Now, he's the CEO who can't even remember my birthday. I looked at the screen. A PIP notice, filled with ChatGPT emojis and fake professional tone. My heart didn't break. It turned to ice. He didn't even write it. He let a stranger use a machine to tell me I wasn't enough. I read it twice, then a third time, each word colder than the last. 7 years compressed into 4 robotic paragraphs and a smiley face. I want to tell you how it started before I tell you how it ended, because the ending only makes sense if you understand exactly how much I was willing to give up to build it in the first place. I remember the rain. I remember it because it never stopped that whole semester, like the sky itself couldn't decide whether to cry or just get it over with. Kael and I lived in a shoebox apartment above a laundromat. The dryers ran all night. We used to joke that we didn't need heaters. The machines below did the job for free. We had one mug between us, chipped on the rim. We took turns. The Nexus Corp offer came by email on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary weekday that has no business changing the direction of a person's whole life. I remember opening it standing in the kitchen, still in yesterday's clothes, holding a bowl of instant noodles that had gone cold while I stared at the screen. A signing bonus large enough to erase my mother's medical debt in a single transaction. A title, a guaranteed seat in their engineering division, the kind of opportunity people spend entire careers trying to manufacture for themselves. I read it 3 times before I said anything to Kael at all. He was on the floor, laptop balanced on a stack of textbooks, deep in some pitch deck he'd rewritten for the 4th time that week. I remember the particular quality of the silence in that apartment. Not empty, just full of 2 people concentrating on 2 very different futures. "Nexus Corp," I said, finally, and he looked up. I watched something flicker across his face. Not panic, not yet. Something quieter. Calculation, maybe? Or maybe I only imagine that now, looking backward through 7 years of hindsight that makes everything sharper than it actually was in the moment. "That's a big offer," he said. "It is. You should take it if you want to." He said it like it cost him nothing, like the sentence didn't have a hook buried inside it, waiting to see whether I'd bite. I didn't take it. I told him no the same week, sitting across from him in a diner that served coffee so bad we joked it was technically a health hazard. I told him I believed in what we were building. That part was true. I did believe in it. I believed in him in a way that made the belief feel indistinguishable from love, because for me, at 22, they were the same thing. I never told him the real reason, that I couldn't imagine building a life anywhere he wasn't standing in the middle of it. That the offer from Nexus Corp wasn't a career decision, it was a fork in the road, and I chose the path that kept me next to him even if it meant walking away from every rational reason to do otherwise. So, I stayed. I built the back end of his first product alone in that same shoebox apartment, powered by instant noodles and a laptop that overheated if you looked at it wrong. I coded until my eyes blurred, until the lines on the screen stopped meaning anything and started just looking like static. He pitched, I built. That was the shape of us. His voice out in front, my hands doing the quiet, invisible work that made his voice worth listening to. The night we hit our first $10,000 in revenue, we didn't celebrate with champagne. We didn't have money for that. We sat on the floor of that leaking apartment, passing the one-chipped mug back and forth filled with instant coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard and somehow still felt like the best thing I'd ever tasted. Kael looked at me that night. Really looked at me. The kind of look that makes a person's chest go tight. The kind you replay for years afterward trying to figure out exactly what it meant. "When we make it to the top," he said, "it'll just be us. No one else matters." I believed him. I thought us meant something. I thought it meant a life, a future where two names sat side by side on something bigger than either of us alone, a partnership in every sense of the word, not just the legal one. I was wrong. Us meant the company. It never meant me. I didn't know that yet. Not that night. That night, I just held on to those words like they were a promise carved into stone, something permanent I could return to whenever the work got hard, whenever the hours got long, whenever a part of me quietly wondered if I was giving more than I was receiving. I turned down Nexus Corp. I turned down security. I turned down a version of my life where I didn't spend 7 years quietly disappearing into someone else's success. I chose him. He chose the company. I just didn't realize for a very long time that those were two different things, and that one day he would choose the company loudly, publicly, and completely, while I remained the quiet variable in an equation nobody else could see. There's a version of this story where I tell you I regretted turning down Nexus Corp the very next week. That's not true. For the first 2 years, I never once looked back. We slept 4 hours a night and called it passion. We ate the same instant noodles so many times that the smell of them still catches me off guard in grocery stores years later, like a scent tied to a memory I didn't ask to relive. I remember the first time a stranger recognized Kael on the street. Some kid, maybe 19, who'd used our app to build a small side business selling handmade candles. He stopped Kael outside a coffee shop and told him, with a kind of sincerity you can't fake, that the platform we'd built had changed his life. Kael thanked him, shook his hand, posed for a photo. I stood 2 feet away, the person who'd built the exact feature that kid was thanking him for, and nobody asked my name. I didn't mind, not then. I told myself the spotlight was Kael's to hold because he was the one willing to stand in it. I preferred the quiet. I preferred being the reason things worked, rather than the reason people clapped. That was true for a long time. It stopped being true somewhere around year 5, though I didn't admit that to myself until much later. There's another memory I keep coming back to, one I've never told anyone. It was the night before our first real investor pitch, the one that would decide whether the company survived past its first year or folded quietly like 100 other ideas that never made it out of somebody's apartment. Kael was terrified. He didn't say it out loud. He never said things like that out loud. But I could see it in the way he kept rewriting the same slide over and over, the way his hands moved a little too fast when he talked, the way he laughed at things that weren't funny just to fill the silence. We stayed up until 4 in the morning running through the pitch, me playing the skeptical investor, him defending numbers I'd pulled together from nothing but hope and spreadsheets. Somewhere around 3 a.m., exhausted, we stopped rehearsing and just sat there, on the floor, backs against the couch, not saying anything. "What happens if this doesn't work?" he asked. It wasn't rhetorical. He actually wanted an answer. "Then we try something else," I said. "Together." He turned his head and looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that makes the air in a room feel different. "You always say that like it's simple." "It is simple," I told him. "You and me. Everything else is just details." I meant it as comfort. I meant it, if I'm honest with myself now, as something closer to a confession I didn't have the courage to say plainly. He never responded to it directly. He just nodded, like he'd filed it away somewhere. And a few hours later, we walked into that pitch meeting and got our first yes. I've replayed that night more times than I can count, trying to figure out whether you and me ever meant to him what it meant to me, or whether I built an entire emotional architecture out of a sentence he'd already forgotten by the time we hit our first $1 million in revenue. I still don't have an answer. I'm not sure I ever will. There was a version of Kael that existed only at 10 p.m. Every night, without fail, at exactly 10 o'clock, he would appear at my desk with a coffee. Not just any coffee. He remembered exactly how I took it. Oat milk, 1 sugar, extra hot because I always let it go cold while I worked. He'd set it down without a word, sometimes rest a hand on my shoulder for exactly as long as it took to say, "Don't stay too late," and then he'd disappear back into his office. It wasn't romantic, not on paper. It was just a coffee. But it was the only proof I had that I still existed to him as a person and not a resource. In the early years, that ritual felt like enough. It felt like a language only the two of us spoke, one line of it delivered every single night without fail, like a small, steady heartbeat underneath everything else that was growing louder and more chaotic around us. I want to walk you through exactly how that heartbeat slowed down, because it didn't stop all at once. It faded the way most important things fade, so gradually that you only notice the absence once it's already permanent. Year 4 was the year the company moved out of the co-working space and into its first real office. 12 desks, a glass conference room, my name on the org chart under a title that sounded impressive and paid exactly the same as it had the year before. I told myself the raise would come once we hit our next funding round. It did. The raise didn't. Year 5 was the year Kael stopped eating lunch at his desk with me and started eating it in meetings I wasn't invited to. I understood at first. Investors, board members, the mechanics of scaling a company require rooms that not everyone fits into. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine that year. Year 6 was the year that 10 p.m. coffee started arriving at 10:15, then 10:30, then some nights not at all, replaced by a text message instead. Running late, don't wait up. Sent from a phone that I knew, because I'd built half the systems that phone connected to, was usually sitting in the back of a car on the way home from a dinner I hadn't been invited to. By then, the company wasn't a dorm room dream anymore. It was a glass tower with our logo etched in the lobby floor, visible from the street, lit up at night like a monument to everything we'd built. Kael wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. He had a driver. He had a calendar managed by 3 assistants who scheduled his day down to the 15-minute increment. And somehow, none of those increments belonged to me anymore. My salary hadn't moved in 3 years. I never asked for a raise. I told myself it didn't matter, that the work mattered more, that he'd notice eventually, that loyalty like mine was the kind of thing that gets recognized in its own time. That's the quiet lie ambitious, loyal people tell themselves right up until it costs them everything. I know that now. I didn't know it then. Somewhere in year 6, I started noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice before. The way Kael's assistant scheduled his calendar in 15-minute blocks that never once included my name, not even for the operational reviews that used to be a standing weekly meeting between the two of us. The way he'd started referring to the company as my company in interviews, a small pronoun shift that landed like a slap every time I heard it, even though I told myself each time that it was just a figure of speech, that language like that didn't mean anything, that I was reading too much into syllables that cost him nothing to say. I remember one specific night, close to midnight, sitting alone in the office with a spreadsheet that wouldn't balance no matter how many times I ran the numbers. I texted him, something small. A question about a client contract that only he could answer. He read it. I watched the little indicator confirm it. He didn't respond until the next morning, a single word later. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the word on my screen, feeling something shift quietly in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't anger. It was closer to grief, the kind that arrives early before the thing you're grieving has technically ended, like your body already knows something your mind hasn't caught up to admitting. I still remember the last night the 10 p.m. coffee arrived on time. I don't remember the date. I wish I did. I wish I'd known in the moment that I should pay closer attention, because it turned out to be the last ordinary night of something I'd spent 6 years building a life around. Kael came back from an industry gala the following week, with champagne still on his breath and a stranger on his arm. Silas. Tall, magnetic, the kind of charm that fills a room before he said a single true thing in it. The kind of person who has never once in his entire life had to prove himself through work that no one saw. By morning, Silas had a title, General Manager. My title, functionally. The role I had built the operational backbone for, quietly, for 6 years, handed to a man who'd known Kael for exactly 1 evening over 2 glasses of champagne and a conversation about golf. The coffee stopped that week. 10 p.m. came and went. My desk stayed empty of everything except the blue glow of my monitor and the growing, quiet certainty that something in me had already started leaving before I consciously decided to go. I want to be clear about something, because I need to say it once, plainly before the rest of this story unfolds. The heartbreak was never really about the job. It was the moment I finally understood I had never been special to him. Not really. Not in the way I had built my entire adult life around believing I was. I didn't just lose my career when I read that email. I lost the man I'd been in love with for 7 years. Kael didn't just allow a stranger to use AI to write a report. He used it to erase me. 7 years of loyalty reduced to a template. 7 years of silence about how I felt reduced to a bullet-pointed list of areas for improvement. 7 years of choosing him every single day, in every quiet way a person can choose someone without ever saying it, reduced to an email he didn't even bother to read before approving. That's the part that still sits somewhere under my ribs like a stone. Not the demotion, not the frozen salary, not even Silas with his gala smile and his empty file reviews. It was realizing that if I disappeared tomorrow, Kael would feel the absence of my competence long before he felt the absence of me. Silas's first day started with a tour he didn't ask for and clearly didn't want. Kael walked him through the office personally, something he hadn't done for a single new hire in 3 years, introducing him to people whose names I'd had to remind Kael of just that morning. When they reached my desk, Kael gestured at me the way you gesture at a piece of furniture that's always been there. "This is Lian. He handles operations." 4 words. 3 years of nights and weekends, of client relationships built from nothing, of a company that would have collapsed a dozen times over without the invisible scaffolding I'd built underneath it, reduced to a job title read off like a name tag. Silas shook my hand. His grip was practiced, the kind of handshake taught in a seminar. "Great to meet the man behind the curtain," he said, already looking past me toward the next person on the tour. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd been told it didn't matter so many times by so many versions of myself that the sentence had started to lose its meaning entirely. The way a word starts to sound foreign if you repeat it enough times in a row. By his second week, Silas had requested access to every project file in the shared drive. I gave it to him without hesitation. I had nothing to hide. 3 years of clean, careful, occasionally brilliant work sat in those folders, documented in more detail than anyone had ever asked me to provide. Silas didn't read a single file before he started grading them. I watched him do it. 3 years of quarterly reports, client contracts, technical documentation, the entire architecture of a business I had quietly kept alive. And he clicked through them the way a person skims a menu they've already decided not to order from. "Below expectations," he wrote next to my name, 7 times on 7 different projects. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't request a single walkthrough. He simply decided in the span of an afternoon that I was the problem he'd been hired to solve. I should have seen it coming. Looking back, every piece was already in place. The new manager who owed his position to charm instead of competence, the CEO too distracted by his own reflection in the glass tower to notice the foundation cracking beneath it, and me, still showing up every day at 9 a.m., still refusing coffee from anyone but the one person who'd stopped bringing it. The 11 p.m. ping came on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was still at my desk. Of course I was. I was always still at my desk. "Performance Improvement Plan," the subject line read. Clean, clinical, the kind of phrase HR departments invented so that cruelty could hide behind a font. I opened it, and the first thing I saw wasn't the content. It was the structure, the rhythm of it. Bullet points that felt too smooth, too symmetrical, sentences stitched together with the kind of confident vagueness that only a machine produces when it has no actual understanding of the person it's describing. Then I saw it. Sitting there, forgotten, at the very top of the email, a single line that should have been deleted before sending. As a professional HR manager, write a performance improvement notice for an underperforming employee named Lian using a firm but empathetic tone. The prompt. Left in, uncut, unedited, a ghost of the laziness that had just decided my professional fate. I sat with that sentence longer than I want to admit. I read it the way you read something you're hoping will change if you just look at it enough times. It didn't change. It sat there, exactly as careless as it had been the first time. Proof that not one human hand had paused, even briefly, to consider what these words would do to the person receiving them. Below it, the email unfolded exactly the way you'd expect a machine to write heartbreak. Generic phrases, hollow encouragement, a small cheerful checkmark emoji sitting incongruously beside a paragraph informing me my contributions no longer aligned with company growth targets. Another emoji 2 lines down, a little clapping icon attached to a sentence congratulating me with false enthusiasm on the opportunity for growth this plan represented. I almost laughed. It came out instead as something closer to a breath being pushed out of my chest. The M dashes were the worst part. Something about them, clean, sterile, evenly spaced, appearing every few sentences like punctuation performing confidence it hadn't earned, made the whole thing feel like it had been assembled rather than written. Like grief manufactured on an assembly line, packaged and shipped directly to the one person in the building who had never once needed to be handled with a template. I scrolled to the bottom, half expecting some kind of human signature, some acknowledgement that a real person had at least skimmed this before sending it into my life like a small, precise detonation. There wasn't one. And there, in the CC field, sitting quietly among the recipients like it belonged there, Kael. He hadn't written a word of it, but he'd seen it. He'd approved it. He hadn't paused, hadn't questioned it, hadn't picked up the phone to ask what was actually happening to the person who built half of what he now called his empire. He let a machine do what he didn't have the courage or the care to do himself. I sat in my office long after everyone had gone home. The overhead lights had gone into their after-hours dim, that strange blue-gray glow that makes every office feel like the inside of an aquarium after visiting hours. I found an old photo on my phone. University. Kael and me squeezed into a photo booth outside a convenience store, both of us laughing at something I no longer remember. He had his arms slung around my shoulders like it was the easiest, most natural thing in the world. I remember thinking at the time that I could live inside that feeling forever. I stared at that photo for a long time. I didn't cry. I thought I would. I'd built up 7 years of unspoken feeling, and I expected it to come pouring out all at once, the way water finally breaks through when a dam gives. Instead, something quieter happened. Something that felt less like breaking and more like finally putting something down that I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had weight. I thought about the diner, the bad coffee, the Nexus Corp offer I'd folded up and thrown away without telling anyone how close I'd come to taking it. I thought about 6 years of 10 p.m. coffees delivered like clockwork by a man who apparently never once considered what they meant to the person receiving them. I am enough on my own. I said it out loud, once, to the empty office. It sounded strange in my own voice, unfamiliar, like a sentence that belonged to someone braver than me. But I said it again anyway, and the second time it sounded a little more like the truth. I scrolled further back through my phone, past the photo booth picture, into years of screenshots and messages I'd apparently saved without ever meaning to build an archive out of them. A photo of the diner where I turned down Nexus Corp. A blurry picture of the first office taken the day we signed the lease, both of us grinning like idiots in front of a door that didn't even have our logo on it yet. A screenshot of the first client contract we ever closed, forwarded to me by Kael at 2 in the morning with the caption, "We did it." We. Not you. Not I. We. I used to hold on to that word like it meant something permanent. Sitting in that dark office 7 years later, staring at the same word on an old screenshot, I finally let myself ask the question I'd been avoiding since the day the coffee ritual quietly stopped. Had we ever meant anything to him beyond the company itself? Or had I spent 7 years mistaking shared ambition for shared feeling, building an entire relationship out of a pronoun he used the way other people use punctuation, automatically, without weight, without any deeper intention behind it. I didn't have an answer. I still don't fully. But sitting there, phone in hand, VIP email still glowing faintly on my monitor, I realized the answer didn't matter as much as I'd always assumed it would. Whatever "we" had meant to him, it clearly hadn't meant enough to make him pick up the phone and ask a single question before letting a stranger and a language model decide my fate. That realization didn't feel like anger. It felt like clarity, sharp and sudden, the kind that rearranges a person's priorities in the space of a single breath. I didn't slam a door. I didn't send an email defending 7 years of work to people who had already decided it didn't matter. I did something quieter and far more effective. I spent the night going through everything. Every manual workaround, every undocumented script, every piece of operational duct tape I had quietly applied over 3 years to keep a growing company from falling apart at the seams. The passwords only I remembered. The client relationships I managed with handwritten notes instead of a CRM because the CRM Silas insisted on had never actually worked properly, and I was the only one who knew that. One by one, I removed myself from the architecture of a company that had already removed me from its plans. It took hours, longer than I expected. 7 years leaves fingerprints in more places than you realize until you actually sit down and try to trace them all. A script here that auto-generated invoices because the official system charged the wrong currency half the time. A spreadsheet there that tracked vendor relationships nobody else knew existed, built because I got tired of watching good partnerships slip through cracks in a CRM that was never configured properly in the first place. A private folder of notes on every major client, written in shorthand only I could fully decode, containing the kind of detail that turns a transactional relationship into a lasting one. The name of a client's daughter, the anniversary of a difficult year in their business, the specific way one particular account manager preferred to receive bad news. None of that lived in any official system. All of it lived in me, quietly, the way important things often do when nobody bothers to ask where the knowledge is actually stored. I didn't delete any of it out of spite. I want to be honest about that, even now. I simply stopped being the extension cord plugged into outlets no one else knew existed. If the company wanted to keep running the way it always had, it needed to build real systems, real documentation, real redundancy. The things I had quietly been substituting with my own labor because it was faster, in the moment, to just handle it myself than to fight for the resources to do it properly. I didn't sabotage anything. I want to be clear about that. I simply stopped being the invisible scaffolding holding up a building that had already told me it didn't need me. I printed a folder, neat, labeled in clean black lettering, "Final Handover." Inside, I left nothing but a single sheet of paper. Since my performance is unsatisfactory, I've removed the unsatisfactory elements. Good luck with your AI manager. I placed the folder in the center of Kael's desk, squared perfectly with the edges, the way I'd learned to do everything for him over 7 careful years. Then I picked up my phone and made a call I should have made a long time ago. The voice on the other end of the line didn't hesitate. Nexus Corp had made me an offer once, years earlier, in a version of my life I'd walked away from for a promise that turned out to be worth less than the paper it was never even written on. "We've been waiting for you," the voice said. "Whenever you're ready." I was ready. By 9 the next morning, I had a signed contract, a new title, and a quiet, cold clarity settling into my chest where heartbreak used to live. Day 1. I heard about it secondhand, the way you hear about a storm that's already passed by the time the news reaches you. Kael asked for the quarterly report. Silas tried to generate it the way he generated everything else, feeding vague instructions into an AI model and expecting competence to appear on command. Except the prompt wasn't prompting. The system that produced numbers depended on data pipelines only I knew how to access, structured in a way no machine could reverse engineer from a folder of nothing. The passwords didn't work, not because I'd changed them out of spite, but because they'd never belonged to a shared system in the first place. I had built manual safeguards years ago, quietly, without asking for credit, because I cared about keeping the company secure in a way no one else seemed to. Kael, I heard, stood in the doorway of my old office for a long moment, staring at an empty desk before asking where I was. No one had an answer for him. Silas apparently laughed it off in the meeting, said something about how these things happen during transitions, and moved on to the next agenda item like the missing pieces of an entire company's infrastructure were a minor scheduling issue. By the afternoon, that confidence had started to crack. A second department reported the same problem. A set of vendor contracts, all routed through a manual approval process I'd built after the official system lost an entire quarter's worth of signatures 2 years ago. Silas tried to draft a replacement contract himself. I heard later that it took him 4 hours to produce something a first-year paralegal could have written in 20 minutes, and the version he finally sent out was missing an entire liability clause. Kael called my old number twice that day. I watched both calls arrive on my new phone, in my new office, and let them ring out. There was a time I would have answered on the first ring, out of habit, out of loyalty so automatic it didn't feel like a choice. That time was over. I let the phone go quiet on its own. Day 2, a client I had personally onboarded 3 years earlier, one whose specific technical requirements existed nowhere except in my head and in the careful notes I'd kept for myself, called to say they were reconsidering the partnership. Silas, apparently, hadn't known those requirements existed at all. He'd walked into the call unprepared, treated a 3-year relationship like a first date, and the client had noticed immediately. By the end of that call, the client had asked, directly, where I had gone. Silas apparently hadn't known those requirements existed at all. He'd walked into the call unprepared, treated a 3-year relationship like a first date, and the client had noticed immediately. By the end of that call, the client had asked, directly, where I had gone. Silas didn't have an answer. Neither, I imagine, did Kael, standing somewhere just out of frame in that meeting, watching a relationship I'd spent years building start to unravel in real time because no one had thought to ask me a single question before deciding I was disposable. I heard later that Kael tried reaching out to the client personally that evening, attempting to smooth things over with the kind of charm that had once been enough to close every deal in the company's history. It didn't work the way it used to. Charm can open a door, but it can't tell you a client's specific compliance requirements from memory, can't reference the exact phrasing of a contract clause negotiated 18 months earlier, can't produce, on demand, the quiet operational knowledge that only comes from actually doing the work yourself, year after year, without ever once being asked to. That afternoon, Kael finally opened the folder I'd left on his desk. I imagine him lifting the cover, expecting, what? Documentation? Instructions? Some final act of loyalty from the person who had spent 7 years being loyal to a fault. Instead, he found nothing but a single printed page, Silas's AI-generated PIP email, printed in full, prompt and all, sitting there as the only explanation he was going to get. I wasn't there to see his face. I didn't need to be. I already knew exactly what it felt like to have a stranger's careless words be the last thing standing between you and everything you'd built. Weeks passed. I stopped checking my old email. I stopped wondering whether the passwords had been fixed, whether the client had stayed, whether Kael had finally learned how to draft a simple contract without someone else doing it for him. None of it was my weight to carry anymore. My new office had windows on 2 sides. I noticed that the first morning, standing there with a coffee I'd made myself, exactly the way I liked it, at whatever hour I chose to make it. No one delivered it to me. I didn't need them to. The work itself felt almost unfamiliar in how straightforward it was. People here read files before they judged them. My new manager scheduled a walkthrough of my previous work within the first week, not to find fault, but to understand what I'd built and how I thought. Nobody handed me a PIP disguised as a performance review. Nobody left the evidence of their laziness sitting at the top of an email like a signature they'd forgotten to erase. I heard updates about the old company occasionally, the way you hear about a city you used to live in, secondhand, filtered through people who still had one foot in that world. The client that almost left had, in fact, left. 2 others followed within the month. Silas, I heard, had been quietly moved into an advisory role that came with a nicer title and considerably less responsibility, the corporate version of being politely asked to leave without anyone having to say the words out loud. I didn't feel triumphant hearing any of it. I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to distance, The particular relief of watching a storm move across a horizon you're no longer standing under. The industry gala came around again, the same kind of event where Kael had once found Silas over a glass of champagne and handed my future without a second thought. I walked in wearing a suit tailored to fit exactly the way I wanted to be seen, not the quiet, overworked shadow in the cubicle in the corner, but someone who belonged in rooms like this on his own terms. I was standing beside the Nexus Corp CEO, introduced to the room as their new Chief Operating Officer, when I saw him. Kael crossed the room like a man walking towards something he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch anymore. "Lian," he said, just my name at first, like he'd forgotten how to build a sentence around it. I didn't say anything. I let him find his own way there. "I made a mistake," he finally said. "Please, come back." I studied his face for a moment. He looked older than I remembered, though it had only been a few months. Whatever chaos had followed my exit had clearly taken something out of him that the tailored suits in the corner office couldn't disguise. "You didn't make a mistake, Kael," I said. "You made 100 small ones, every day, for years, and then you let a stranger's laptop make the final one for you." He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I don't think he had an answer ready for that. I don't think, in 7 years, he had ever needed to have one. "Silas still work for you?" I asked, mostly out of curiosity, though the question landed somewhere closer to cruelty than I intended. "He's been reassigned," Kael said quietly. "Of course he has." There was a time, not so long ago, when those 5 words would have undone me completely, when I would have found a way to forgive him before he'd even finished explaining why he needed forgiving. Instead, I felt something colder, calmer, something that didn't ache the way I expected it to. I looked at him the way you look at a stranger who's mistaken you for someone else. "I'm not a redundant employee anymore, Kael," I said, my voice even, unhurried. "I'm way above your paycheck." I let the silence sit there for a moment before I added the part that had been living, unspoken, somewhere under my ribs for 7 long years. "And to think I actually had feelings for you." I turned. I didn't look back to see his expression. I didn't need to. Some doors don't need to be slammed to close completely. Some just need to be walked away from, calmly, in a suit that finally fits the person you were always capable of becoming. I thought, walking out of that gala into the cool night air, that I'd feel some kind of victory, vindication maybe, the satisfaction of watching someone finally understand exactly what they'd thrown away. Instead, I felt something quieter. A kind of peace I hadn't expected, settling into the space where 7 years of quiet devotion used to live. Not happiness exactly, something closer to relief, the specific relief of finally putting down a weight you'd carried so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. I didn't need Kael's regret to validate the years I'd spent building something real, even if that something turned out to be built on a foundation that couldn't hold the weight of what I'd hoped it would become. The company was never going to love me back. I understand that now in a way I couldn't when I was still inside it, still hoping, still waiting for a version of Kael that only ever existed in a rainy apartment above a laundromat, sharing one chipped mug between 2 people who believed, for a little while, that they were building a future together instead of just a business. I still think about that version of him sometimes, not with anger, just with a kind of distant tenderness, the way you think about a person from a story that happened to someone else, a long time ago, in a life that doesn't quite belong to you anymore. The car was waiting outside when I left the gala. I didn't look back at the building, didn't wonder whether Kael was still standing where I'd left him, working through the weight of 5 words that had cost him 7 years too late to matter. I had somewhere else to be. Someone else was already waiting for the next quarter's projections, and this time I intended to build every single system properly, from the ground up, in a way that would never again depend entirely on one person's quiet, invisible labor to keep it standing. That, I think, was the real ending. Not the confrontation, not the final line, just the simple, steady fact of walking forward into a life that finally, fully belonged to me. The end.